Welcome back to a special episode of This Week in College Viability. And you're used to me, your host, Gary Stalker, being a talking head. And I do that every Monday on this show. And on occasion, a couple times a month, we do a very special episode and we bring in others to talk about higher education. And that's what we're doing today. Ryan Hofer and Bex Groebner have joined me for this podcast episode. We're going to talk about something doesn't come up very often, but I think is a leading indicator of what we may be seeing throughout higher education in the coming months and years. And that's naturopathic medicine, naturopathic doctors, acupuncture, and we'll probably touch on a couple other supplementary alternative medicine disciplines as we go through this. Ryan, thanks for making time to join me.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. Great to be here.
Beck, same thing. You and I did this a couple of years ago, didn't we?
We didn't, but we've been in a meeting that wasn't recorded. But I'm also really happy to be here, and I love the work you're doing in the world. I think it's really important advocacy for students and families.
Well, excellent. So this is a unique discipline, and if you follow higher education at all and follow these alternative medicine disciplines, Ryan and Bex are two of the most frequent commenters on, I guess it's fair to say, the concerns that they have. And Ryan, I'm going to start off with you. And you've been writing a lot about the impact of the loan limits and what they will have on naturopathic medicine and acupuncture in particular, and maybe even disciplines like chiropractics in the coming years or so. Give the listeners kind of a quick primer on what's happening and what the impact may be for these alternative medicine disciplines.
Yeah, the new loan limits are here. They started on July 1st, and Grad Plus loans, which were previously in place, are now no longer available. So students were using Grad Plus loans to borrow up to the cost of attendance. So that's no longer available, and the new loan caps are $50,000 for a very particular set of professional graduate degrees that the Department of Education has defined, and all other graduate degrees are capped at $20,500 annually, and acupuncture graduate degrees and the naturopathic doctorate are currently in that lower category of $20,500. There is a lawsuit currently trying to bring the naturopathic degree up to the $50,000. But when you're looking at a $40,000 cost of attendance, just for tuition, $40,000 just for tuition in year one, which is not uncommon, you can see how the math becomes very difficult. Even if you were at the $50,000 cap, students will still need money for living expenses. And so we have a very dynamic situation. There's the possibility that students will be looking at private loans to make up that difference, which is very concerning to me given the outcomes of the degrees.
And I want to come back to the financial piece a little bit later on, but Bex, I want to start off with a question about accreditation and state licensing boards. Have these state licensing boards outsourced too much of their responsibility to private, professional, nonprofit organizations, in your opinion?
Absolutely. So the way that a healthcare degree works is you have a scope of practice in your state, and it enables you to do X, Y, and Z. And then that state licensing board is tasked by the legislature to ensure that you're trained to do X, Y, and Z as part of your scope. So I live in Oregon, and what Oregon has done in its licensing board is they've said, we're not going to define what that education is. We're just going to go ahead and let this private national nonprofit define what that is, even though all 50 states have a different scope of practice for an acupuncturist. For example, in California, you're a primary care provider, which is going to need more education than someone in Oregon that is not a primary care provider. Yet we have that same standard applied across states created by a for-profit institution, essentially.
So let me do a follow-up on that. And one of the things I do at College Viability is I focus on consumer protection. we have products for moms and dads and students, grandpas and grandmas that look at the financial health of colleges. And I make the case here, accreditation agencies, and to a lesser extent, state agencies, really don't function with a mindset of consumer protection. Is that what you're seeing in these alternative medicine disciplines?
In terms of the licensing board, their entire mission is consumer protection. And so they're supposed to ensure that an MD, a DO, an LAC, the naturopaths are governed under a different board than us here, but they're supposed to ensure that we are safe to practice for the public. And they're outsourcing that to the accreditor because they say they're overworked.
And again, I'm going to stick with you, Bex, and Ryan, I'll get back to you with the follow-up on that. Is the accreditor then abandoning that consumer protection responsibility?
That's a really good question. And I think you would find a lot of different answers from a lot of different people.
Okay.
I think this gets into concepts of credential inflation because what's been put ahead is the prestige of having a master's or doctoral degree, rather than testing competencies to see whether or not that graduate can perform the task that is expected of them. We're saying they have a master's degree and that's what's important to us.
So Ryan, any follow-ups to those questions that I just asked Bex?
Well, when you say consumer protection, I think of it in two different worlds because when students are going through a program and they're purchasing an educational product, then they're the consumer. And so I think that um, we have a long way to go in that. I think it's a good lens to use consumer protection for students, and I think there's been a lot of progress, and there will continue to be a lot of progress on that front. But then when you're talking about the healthcare professional providing the service, then the patient or the client is the consumer, and so how do we make sure that the student has a good consumer experience through the program and is able to get the entry level credential that then they can be provide safe and effective healthcare services to the general public, who is then the healthcare consumer.
So Ryan, before we started recording, you and I were talking, and you made a point that I hadn't thought of before. And naturopathic doctorates, acupuncture, chiropractors, and you said doctors of physical therapy. I said PharmDs. That really
Mm-hmm.
throughout the allied health professions, I guess that's the way to characterize it,
Mm.
we have looked at a scenario where many of these professional associations have raised the entry level requirements to maybe
Mm-hmm.
a level they don't need to be. Am I fair in making that assumption?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's just a general trend that you've seen, and that is the credential inflation that many different career paths, let's say their influential, their governing bodies, their leadership bodies have decided that a doctorate is the entry level credential to shoot for. And that was not always connected to increased earnings. And so I think it's time definitely to take a hard look at different ways for, again, the student as the consumer to access an educational product that has a good return on investment that can still give them entry level competencies and then stack from there. So you can enter in with a bachelor's or a master's degree, and then you can earn while you learn. And then there could still be um, um, higher level credentials
Good
available,
point.
but those would not be required to get that first entry level job.
They would be above the entry level.
Yeah, those. No, I don't think that we're talking about eliminating that increase in knowledge and effectiveness
Right.
and that value. There's still a place for that, but to set that initial bar at the doctorate, that's 3 to 4 years, and
Interesting.
you really can't have. It's difficult to hold a job while you're going through these stressful programs.
Yeah.
I don't think it makes sense for today's economic realities.
Bex?
Yeah, the reason that we go to school is to be able to do this job safely. And in our profession, it's called a practice because once we get out and we're able to do the job safely, then we're really learning through contact with the patient. And so, if the training that our accreditor says is necessary to make us safe is 1900 hours of training, that is a bachelor's degree. But if you're then patching on 2 years of prerequisites required, and those prerequisites cannot count toward any of the 1900 hours and can be in basket weaving,
Yeah.
just so that you can pump that 1900 hour into a graduate degree tuition that costs twice as much, we
Mm.
really have a problem. And like Ryan was saying, if the income isn't making sense, if you have providers in a hospital and the hospital's going, we'll pay you a lot more if you have a doctoral degree, then that makes sense. But what, at least with the acupuncture profession, what we did is we're like, we're going to get a doctoral degree going, and we're going to have that as the only degree, like the entry level degree, and then we're going to get paid more. It's this magical thinking.
Mm.
And I guess I want to do a follow up to that, Bex, and I'll stick with you. What worries you the most right now? Is it the price, the tuition associated with these programs, these ND programs, these acupuncture programs, the amount students have to borrow, and that may be changing in the next couple of years? Or is it the earnings? And again, you shared some notes with me before. Is it the earnings awaiting graduates after they complete these 1900 hours plus 2 years?
So the earnings are abysmal, but personally, I would do this job for the earnings. I do this job for the earnings. I love what I do. I think I have the best job in the world. So, regardless of the pay, I would still do this job. What makes it really hard is the debt. When we're talking about the tuition, whether or not that's a problem, if you look at Stanford University, their debt to income ratio on that HEA group data from September 23, it was 82%, right? But the tuition's really high. You just have all of these graduates and alumni giving back to the school to help balance. So to me, it's like if the tuition is super high, but you have graduates giving back to counter that, then that's also not a problem. So the problem is the borrowing. And the borrowing isn't just bad because it messes with your financial health. We know it's linked to cardiovascular disease and mood disorders, and it increases suicidality. So we really are harming people beyond just financially harming them.
Interesting.
We're creating physical health effects in our students that are supposed to carry this medicine into coming generations for us.
And it's fair to apply that same consequence to every other higher education discipline. If you're under a lot of stress to get that bachelor's
Absolutely.
in sociology or whatever, it would apply across the board. I never thought of it that way. So Ryan, I'm going to go back to maybe make you the finance guy today. So could these loan limits that started a couple weeks ago, could these loan limits change the business model of naturopathic doctorates and acupuncture schools?
I think it definitely is having an effect. I believe the program I went to has already reduced the credits down as much as they can, which was something like a $20,000 reduction. So there's definitely change. And I know like some schools are
Interesting.
offering more scholarships. So I think that is very much a possibility that the tuition will be optimized and the time will be optimized. I think the problem is when you're talking about schools that really rely on just one or two types of bachelor's degrees, like an acupuncture school, a naturopathic school, a chiropractic school. The loan caps just make it more difficult for students to enroll. It's a much more difficult journey, and I think that will affect enrollment. And I think that's where schools are going to be looking to essentially consolidate and try to reach a bigger scale.
So let me do a follow up. I'm going to ask both of you to answer this question because, of course, here at College Viability, our focus is on the financial health and viability of every college that's out there. When we're talking about reduced tuition and even some form of mergers maybe down the road, Ryan, you were talking about, Ryan, are we looking at a scenario where some significant number or percentage of these alternative medicine colleges are at risk of not financially surviving?
I think so. I think it was already an issue before the loan caps. So we were already in decline. That was the Bastyr University show cause sanction, which involved financial stability, and they've now moved out of that onto probation. But they were already the enrollment at my school was already steadily trending downward. So the loan caps, and I think the increased awareness around return on investment is just going to amplify the trend that was already occurring. And I think as you talk about a lot on your show, that unfortunately, like there seems to be this trend in higher education institutions to try and like fake it until you make it and
Yeah.
spin things. And I just I that's not gonna cut it anymore because the decline is so clear, and it's actually it's accelerating too. So you're going to see more precipitous closures as we see large reductions in enrollment, even just from the demographic cliff. There are just less people, and the participation rate is lower. And now you have the loan caps. It's all pushing in the same direction.
So Bex, I see you shaking your head up and down. I presume you tend to agree with what Ryan's talking about.
Yeah, I was adjunct faculty at the Oregon College of Oriental Medicine in 2024 when we got the announcement that they were closing, and they attributed that to a large homeless population and many people around the fancy $1 million campus that they had bought, many people around that campus doing fentanyl. So a school for medicine is closing because it's sitting in an area with too many sick people. Is it always an interesting thing to think about? But they had been in a pretty humble campus out in East Portland for most of their existence before deciding, we need to like make it look really good and buying this huge campus and remodeling this 4-story campus downtown. And that really, they couldn't maintain or sustain that. And a lot of schools have put themselves in this position. So when these loan caps come down, it's really going to be problematic for them.
So it's kind of a build it and hope they will come kind of approach.
Yes, Field of Dreams, Kevin
Right.
Costner.
I watch that. I watch the YouTube video on that every year when they have the guys walking out of the cornfields to that baseball game. It was just last week or something. They had that out in Iowa. So let's go back then, Bex, to accreditation. And a lot of times on my shows and in the media that I do with reporters, I talk about transparency. And so I guess my question to you is in your experience, in your mind, should accreditors be required to publish more financial data, more borrowing data, more completion rate data, more graduate outcome information for their future students to be able to see and making the decision whether to pursue these alternative medicine degrees or not?
Well, absolutely. And like you said, it should be family friendly, easy to navigate information. Whether or not they'll do that is the question. What was surprising to me, actually, going back to OCOM closing, was all of my students were blaming the school. And of course, I was blaming the school as well for the decision making. But once we really dug into some of the data and we started looking at that HEA data, when you have 6,300 graduate schools studied across the country, and then you organize that data by debt to income ratio, and 6 out of the top 10 worst performing schools are accredited by ACAHM. You have to ask, is it the individual school or is it the accreditor that's really playing into that? And maybe we should, I'm not saying the schools are blameless, obviously, but it is really hard. Like Ryan was saying, when you go and you optimize the tuition, but you still have no creativity allowed. So I can optimize the tuition down to $67,000 for the entry level acupuncture degree, but I can't take that and change that from a graduate credit to an undergraduate credit, which is really where we would have some significant cost savings because my hands, as a school administrator, my hands are tied behind my back by that accreditor. And so that's something that I'm not hearing talked about enough, you know?
Yeah, and I'm guessing with no evidence whatsoever that my picture is on the dartboards of many accreditors because on a regular basis I talk about that. Now, not for the alternative medicine accreditors as much, although they're probably deserving, because they really don't provide any kind of consumer protection. And the colleges that closed here recently, the two Massachusetts colleges, Anna Maria and Hampshire, the accreditors were nowhere to be found in terms of giving the public a heads up that, hey, be careful, this college doesn't have the financials to survive. And again, here at College Viability, I look at the data all the time, and it scares the bejeebers out of me, guys, that that you look at the finances, and if you and I were running businesses like this, we wouldn't, because the finances are so bad. I can't possibly envision how hundreds of these colleges can possibly survive with their current business model. So I will jump off of my preacher's board here and we'll move on.
Yeah, can I say
Well,
something
I would,
about that too?
Go ahead, Ryan, please.
There's the financial stability aspect, which I think is just the total like baseline, like there are acupuncture schools that are on heightened cash monitoring one, that's publicly available data, yet there's no information in the accreditor dashboard, there's no information on the school's website, and that's it's a serious thing. It's already been identified that there are financial issues. So I think the financial stability piece is the total low bar, but also there should be, as Bex was saying, family friendly information. Like it can't just be a bunch of info posted on a website. There's been a lot of issues in our fields with W-2 employment versus self-employment. And so, for example, they'll post the Bureau of Labor Statistics data that shows a certain income, but they'll omit the reality that the Bureau of Labor Statistics is using W-2 employment. And yet then their alumni, for my school, NUNM, the alumni survey says that about 85% of graduates are are self-employed.
Right.
So it's that type of thing where you can't like just putting out the data. There has to be um,
Context.
the expert context that no family or student coming in could be reasonably be expected to understand when they're just shopping around initially. So I think the
Now,
context is so important.
in addition to providing college education, colleges are notoriously good for spinning.
Yeah,
And
right. And
always
add that
have,
to it. Yeah.
always will. And I say that all the time. And I realistically, there's nothing wrong with that. But I'm guessing that's why the three of us are chatting today. We are kind of the anti-spin. You colleges are welcome to spin
Yeah.
things any way they want, but you and I are equally welcome to say, well, that's not quite proper context. That's not
Yeah.
quite the proper way to present it. All sorts of things like that, Bex.
yeah, I was just going to add, in February 2024, our acupuncture accreditor, ACAM, came before NASIKI for their federal review. And in that review, Kathleen Alioto told the director that it was somewhat scandalous how particularly Bastyr University was behaving and the debt to income ratio. And his response was, it's a free market. The schools can do what they want to do. Isn't that your job as the regulator of the schools? You know what
One
I
would
mean? It
think,
was an
yeah.
interesting, very interesting conversation with the oversight of the regulator.
Yeah, and I think the free market gets distorted from like, yes, in theory, we're all free to talk about this, but us three are not, equivalent to paid admissions staff
Right.
and paid staff at like the school associations, the Council of Schools, which lobbies and does promotion for the programs, and all of that is funded by the student debt tuition, which happens to keep right going up. So the status quo system just keeps funding itself, and that's what you're seeing now. Is now that the money spigot is getting reduced, everybody's scrambling to try and figure out how to maintain access to the debt funding. But that is separate from the actual realistic outcomes that the student consumer is getting for their time and their money or their debt.
Please go ahead.
And I would just add that something that's really hard for families and students to understand is the incestuous nature of
Yeah,
all of these different institutions and everyone that's
right.
benefiting. For example, there's a man that is the president of our Council of Acupuncture Colleges. He's also the provost of the Virginia University of Integrative Medicine, which has 3 locations and is doing teach outs for some of these closing schools. And he's a site visitor for the accreditor. So he's making money from a school, he's making money as a president of the school association, and he's making money as a site visitor for the regulator of the schools that he works at. And when you start looking behind the curtain of Oz, all you start seeing all this stuff, but it's really difficult for a student to know
Right.
how to gather that.
Yeah,
You
it's a
want to,
rather ends up being like sort of it can be a very small group of people, and the school and their employees are really overrepresented on these accrediting boards and visits. Like, I don't there should be more of a strong attempt to get let's say working professionals and more public representation, I think, rather than just one public member onto these accreditation councils.
and I
And
can't
I,
remember which of you brought this up, but let me run this by you guys, and then Bex, I'll come back to you.
yeah,
We're kind of talking about a David versus Goliath biblical reference here, right?
Hmm.
And a small number of folks, the 3 of us and others, are trying to say, hey, let's think this through. Let's look at all the perspectives. But realistically, and I do another show with an economist who says, Gary, markets function the best when there's information from both sides. In this case, the college, and then the other side for students. And really throughout higher education, and not just in the alternative medicine disciplines, it's really a one-way market. It's the colleges providing the information because they have the resources to do so. And I just wanted to make sure
Hmm.
I shared that. And Bex, thank you. Had something else.
well, that's actually perfect into what I was going to say, because there's 3 pieces for us, which is there is the student and there is the college, but there's the, or should be, the employer on the other side of it. So you go to college in order to do a job, and in nursing, for example, they have a lot of on the job training, and the employer is giving feedback to the school saying the graduate or the intern is able to do the job or they're not able to do the job, and we need you to adjust your education. And in these complementary and alternative medicine, the naturopath and acupuncture programs, what is unique to us is we don't have a single employer at the table of our accreditor, and we don't have employers working at our examiner.
Right.
And so the schools are just kind of like making up whatever they think needs to happen for the training without feedback about whether or not we can do the job.
Interesting.
Hmm.
Well, let's the 3 of us move more to a consumer focus here. And Ryan, I'll start this question with you, but Bex, I'm going to give you the same question. If you had an 18-year-old or 22-year-old or even 30-year-old told you tomorrow, I'm thinking about enrolling in one of these ND or acupuncture programs, what's the first thing you would tell them to investigate?
Mm. It's very important to do a lot of in-depth research because the front stage spin does not match up with the backstage reality. So I think you should look at the earnings, essentially. Look at the earnings and then look at the debt that you will need to take on in order to reach that beginning entry level point, and what are the realistic earnings for that. It's really great that people are want to help society and want to increase healthcare access and are interested in alternative and complementary care. That's amazing, and that's such a great thing and a powerful force for good. Um, However, there are multiple ways to reach that goal. And I would say these current containers with these graduate degrees right now are extremely risky. So I would say just pause and wait. I would wait until after the July 2027 earnings test, because a lot of schools, I think, will be announcing orderly closures after they fail that first test. So the schools you're considering might be announcing an orderly closure within a year. And you don't want to get stuck in that, especially if it's the only program in your state of residence, right? And you would have to completely relocate in order to change your program. So my advice is pause, research, wait for the July 2027 earnings test.
So, Bex, I'm going to go with you to you with the same question. But before you do that, I know the first thing you're going to say to get more information is to go to mycollegeviability.com
Mm,
and take the college viability inspection report, because we have those available for all of these private organizations that do exactly what you're talking about. And again, for perspective, and I showed this many times, when the three of us have bought our houses, right? Over the years, we get our house inspected. When we buy a used car, we get the car inspected. But we really don't, as consumers, throughout this country, we don't do a good job of inspecting the colleges, and especially the foundation, the financial foundation of colleges. And that's one of the reasons we have the college viability business, is we create those tools. So, Beck, since I took those words right out of your mouth, what kind of guidance would you give to an 18-year-old, 22-year-old who says, I'm thinking about going to one of these programs?
Well, thanks for adding that, because that what I do love all of your resources and everything you're doing. And I hope people are following you on LinkedIn and Substack,
Thank
because
you.
it's really helpful. And Ryan and I both, we appreciate you so much.
yes.
Um, this comes back to that three-piece question you asked me before. What if it's the income, if it's the tuition, or if it's the debt that's more problematic? And so prospective students should go and look at the income, but they shouldn't use the Bureau of Labor and Statistics. Like Ryan said, that's W-2 income. There are very few jobs for an acupuncturist. So particularly, I'll speak to that since that's my field. BLS will tell you that you'll make around $80,000 a year. And if you get a job in a hospital and you are a unicorn, then you will make around that every year. But what the HEA data and all of the alumni surveys, which is really hard for a prospective student to get alumni survey data from the schools. You should ask for it. If they're not giving it to you, that's a red flag. But you should look at the actual median incomes for graduates. And for acupuncture, it's somewhere around $40,000 at the fourth year out. And then you want to also look at that financial responsibility composite score, which is available at the studentaid.gov. Although those scores, I think they cut off at 2023. And so something I've been telling
Yeah.
students is if you go to ProPublica, you can get the latest audit. That should be the 2025 audit, and it's going to have the financial responsibility composite score in there. And then you want to make sure that that score is hopefully over 1.5. That said, no acupuncture school is safe right now. Even an acupuncture school that looks pretty stable on its audit, what the stability is giving you is that they might be able to do an orderly closure and keep you at that school for that teach out. I don't know, Ryan might want to speak to that a little bit more, because all acupuncture schools, I haven't seen a single acupuncture school that passes the earnings test that's
Oh,
coming in
my
2027.
goodness. So, Bex, let me keep it with you. And again, you shared a story with me in preparation for today's show. And I can't remember the name of the college, but they had shared with a student, based on what you sent me, that our graduates do very well. That was it. That's all they shared. What evidence should prospective students ask for when you get such goofy, generalized statements like that?
Yeah, so I've heard a lot from these college presidents lately and how great their schools are. And then when they're telling me this, I ask them for their alumni surveys. So they should have these alumni surveys. They should be published, but they're actually quite difficult to get from the schools because they do look very bad. And one thing that the colleges tend to say when they do give you the survey data is they're like, yeah, we see that our graduates are only reporting $25,000 as a median income. However, you'll notice that only 5% of graduates responded. Well, that's on the school. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
To make that better. And if they haven't gone and made that better after all of these years, the students should be
Mm.
really wary of that as well. And the other thing that's been really difficult to get from some of these presidents, not all, some of them have been great, um, is to get a real number about what the debt is. And what they often say to me when I'm like, do you have median debt numbers on your graduates? Is they're like, our financial aid department is so wonderful. They counsel the students, they make sure students aren't borrowing more than they need to. I was like, great, then you should have those numbers available for us, right? But it's just really difficult to get. So those are the two main numbers I would try to get from the school. I would not take this as meaningful in any way. This is the thing that I like to say. We have a 0% default rate, or we have less
Mm.
than 1% default rate. It is next to impossible to default on these federal loans that are eligible for income-based repayment.
Right.
Interesting. So, Ryan, before I go
And
back to you, I want to share with both of you a tool that we just released last week. And it goes back to this question, excuse me, our graduates do very well. It's my experience, and maybe yours, that prospective students don't ask very good questions. So, just last week, we released a tool, and it uses AI. And the name of the tool is the Campus Visit Challenge. The Campus Visit Challenge. And we created a fictional college, and we created a fictional admissions rep, we created a fictional financial aid rep, and you get the chance, students, moms and dads, grandpas and grandmas, aunts and uncles, get the chance to ask practice questions based on what's important to them. Is it graduation rates? Is it income? Whatever the case may be. And then once you ask this series of, I think it's up to 8 questions, we'll tell you whether you were too nice, you were too polite, you were gullible, or whether you just drilled right down to get what you wanted. So it's a free tool. It's out there at My College Viability and Campus Visit Challenge. It's the only name out there, so you can search on that. And it's a free tool to kind of let you practice that, so you can ask that question that I teach you about. Our graduates do very well. You can't let an admissions rep or a college president, whoever it was that said that, you can't let them get away with that. But yet tend to be an overly polite society, especially when it comes to higher education. And we let admissions reps who are paid by the college and financial aid folks who are paid by the college dance around questions. And we just released that tool last week to make it easier to practice those questions. All right. So Ryan,
yeah,
next 12
I
months.
wish I could I wish I could rewind back to when I was looking at these different programs and use that tool. I'm so thankful that's out there for people.
And we've
yeah,
gotten a lot
and
of positive feedback on the early versions of that. Ryan.
yeah, it's so great. I think if you can to involve more people, relatives and family, if that's available to you, especially since in a lot of cases they might be co-signing these
Right.
loans or doing the Parent Plus loans or co-signing on a private loan. So this can really affect your family's, your extended family's finances. And then, of course, it's your time and money too. I did want to highlight one thing before we move on of something that the schools will often say, these programs related to income, is that they'll say, oh, a lot of our graduates are self-employed. So their reported income, that's not actually how much they're making. And in the early stage, they're reinvesting a lot of their income into the business,
Right. Right.
which could be true. However, that money is not net. What's really important is your net income, because
Yeah.
that's your discretionary income, right? That's what you're living on, and that's what's available to service the debt. So I'm not sure why that talking point. I think it kind of sounds nice. It's like, oh, actually, our graduates are making way more money, but they're just entrepreneurs who are building their business. And I think that should be, really scrutinized, that
Yeah. The net is an
that
important number.
perspective.
So Ryan, I'm an ND student. I'm an acupuncture student. Let's look ahead. I'm a current student. Well, let's look ahead for the next 12 months. And I need to decide if this program continues to make financial sense or not. What should I be looking for?
That's really hard. And a lot of what I think that I tend to focus on is new prospective students to say, whoa, whoa, pause and look at these. It gets tougher when you're in. There are definitely issues with maintaining legacy status for grad plus loans, right? And not being able to transfer and only being able to take approved leaves of absence. So there's that issue for current students. Current students also, since they're going to borrow after July 1st, they're only going to have access to the RAP income-based repayment plan, which is 30 years of payments until discharge instead of 20 or 25. But it's hard because there is a sort of sunk cost issue, right? It's like, well, if you just have one more year left, then you have to weigh your options. Um, and yeah, it's a very difficult situation. However, I would strongly suggest that current students, insist on the transparency of the school. How is the school resourcing your education, especially in an environment where enrollment's decreasing, the just the financial resources are getting reduced. So current students can really ask good questions of their program deans and their school administrators related to, is my is the focus on the quality of the student learning experience, even in a time of reduced resources.
So Ryan, I'm gonna stick with you. And we talked about private lending as an option early on in the show today. And as students turn to private loans to cover the gap between government loans and the need, does the private lending market, private banks, private entities, become kind of a new form of accountability? Because these lenders will require some kind of collateral for the loan, some kind of guarantees that those loans can be repaid.
Yeah, that's possible. I mean, we've done the private loan thing before the Grad Plus program. The Grad Plus program was meant to step in and stop the private lending,
Right.
from what I've heard. But okay, we're back to the private lending. I am I I would be surprised if the private lending market as it develops will even put make these loans available
Interesting.
to students of these programs, because if we three can look at the data and say that loan's not getting paid back, like the earnings data is there, then
Yeah.
surely a lender can do that as the market kind of develops and as they develop a history and a methodology for that. But that's where I get really concerned with the co-signing aspect, because they might say, well, you don't have credit, but your parents do, so they can co-sign and you can take out this private loan. The terms are just likely to be not as good as a federal loan, and you don't have the income-based repayment options, and they're going to, I think, pursue you to recoup their money because that was their investment, and they'll, send your they'll sell your loan to a collections agency, and you could have your wages garnished,
Yeah.
and that's on top of trying to start out as an entry level professional in the very difficult environment.
Bex.
Well, I was just gonna add on, that was so well said, Ryan. But essentially, it will become a form of accountability, just even how the schools are telling prospective students our default rate is really low. Well, if you move into these private loans, your default rate is not going to remain below one for
Yeah.
in a very short time.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right.
So I have one final question, and it's going to go to both of you. And Bex, I'm going to start with you, and Ryan, you'll get the last chance here. And we're going to go to the mountaintop. And Bex, we're going to make you queen. Ryan, we're going to make you king of alternative medicine. And here's my question. It's kind of thorough, so feel free to take a second to ponder. So, Bex, if you could rebuild this system tomorrow at the level of schools and accreditors and state licensing boards and national exams, what would you keep? What would you eliminate? And then finally, what kind of person would you put in charge of protecting the student?
Yeah, so this is really interesting because I tend to go, oh, the money should just be going direct from the federal government to the school. And then the job on the other side of that school should be determining whether or not the graduate has been trained to do what they're supposed to be able to do. And so the accountability really should come from the employer back to the government. And that just seems like a really nice way to loop it all in. So we don't have to have this middleman accreditor in the first place. I don't think that's going to happen.
Right.
So if we do keep the accreditor there, it should be really this is a competency based standard rather than a degree based standard in terms of measuring whether or not that graduate is able to do what they need for the job. And then we should have employers sitting on the boards of these accreditors so that we have that circle of input going from the school to the government and to the student, and that we know that everyone's able to do their job. I was a chef for a long time and I learned on the job. And you have to have your knife skills good enough to brunoise the ginger before you move up to doing the broiler, and that's something that professions, nursing and other healthcare professions have been pushing for a while, is competency based measurements that are really telling us what a student is learning or not. So I would eliminate these degree requirements, these credential requirements, and instead work more with competency. The state licensing boards and the people that are elected to be on those boards really need to start doing their jobs. And when this comes to healthcare, their job is to protect the patient. And like Ryan said, their job is also to protect the student. And so they need to be looking and ensuring that the graduate can do what the scope of practice says that they can do, and that employers are coming back saying that, yes, the graduate's able to do this. And then as far as what I would keep, man, there's just so many broken pieces of this whole system. I'm going to have to think on that for a little while. Maybe as
Okay.
Ryan's talking, I'll think about that.
Mm.
But the person in charge really should be people in charge, and there needs to be student representatives that are giving feedback. Information doesn't just flow from the top down. The student is really, really important, and they're not having their voice heard. I think that's work that Ryan and I are both trying to do right now, is talk to students and get what they're telling us out into the community. Even some of these school presidents seem shocked by it. These are the people walking around in your own institution, and you need to be conversing with them and holding what they say as something of value in how decisions are being made. So the student and the employer need to be brought to the table more. All right,
So
Ryan.
Ryan, let me read the question again, because it's a pretty substantial question. I'm going to put you on the mountaintop. The whole world and of alternative medicine is listening to you. If you could rebuild this system tomorrow for schools, accreditors, licensing boards, state licensing boards, and national exams, what would you keep? What would you eliminate? And who would you put in charge of protecting the student? Ryan, all yours.
I am very sympathetic to the concept of accreditation, that it is a group that comes together and decides on a standard. So I think I would keep voluntary accreditation, but I would eliminate the regulatory monopoly that I think a lot of times the accreditors, although they're not allowed to lobby, I think they've been for their own regulatory monopolies, and the council of the schools that are accredited are for the regulatory monopoly. So um, I would eliminate that and open up multiple parallel pathways to licensure. I would keep employable high yield skills, and that would be if the voluntary accreditation involved assessing what are the employable high yield skills, then that would mean when a program is accredited, that's a mark of the high quality of it. And I think that's an example of how the market could function, that flow through of information. As far as protecting students, I do think state legislatures have a role, especially when it comes to the private loans. There should be laws in place to assure those the private loan market is functioning transparently. I would love to see a staff member at the school that's tasked with innovation and listening to students, and especially listening to new graduates, and that the continuous improvement model is really like resourced by actual staff time and focused attention, and that staff member who's in charge of innovation should be given time at the quarterly board meetings to speak out and to um, provide documentation on the record about, like, here's the problems we're identifying, here's what students and new grads are telling me, and here's a deliverable that's a proposal for the board of how we could innovate and increase, optimize the resources that are available, increase access, and move into like sensible credentials that make more sense.
So finally, let's do a last call. And Bex Groebner, you're up first. Last call. What do you want to make sure you add to this conversation?
Yeah, just I guess I would say for any students listening to just go in and sign up in the federal, well, use all the resources through your institution that you've named in this episode here, but also to go in and sign up for that federal register for education so that they're getting some of these things that are coming out, these bulletins that are coming out, and they can start understanding that framework. I taught jurisprudence in these schools for a really long time, and people and graduates, they just really don't understand the whole channel of how everything comes down from the government, goes into these institutions, and then trickles down to you as a student. And so just being able to look at the bigger picture and understanding what's coming out, seeing that you can go to ProPublica and download 990s for many of these institutions, you can get the audits, you can get the scores. It's really important to empower yourself with that data so that you're not feeling victimized at the end of all of this because you didn't go through and look at some of the resources that were available. And I and Ryan both respond to students all the time. So you're welcome to email us if you are specifically wanting information about acupuncture and naturopathic schools beyond what's provided through your org, Gary. So I think I'll leave it there.
Ryan, last word is yours.
Well, there are tools out there. There are people working to increase transparency. So a little research on the front end, little prevention goes a long way. And if you are in a program, your student voice is really important. And especially your new graduate voice is really important. I think a lot of times these conversations are really filled with people who have had the credential for 15 years or 20 years, and they're making decisions based on their experience a lot of the time. And they're making decisions about, the experience of current students and new grads. Like, the decisions they're making are really actually influencing current students and new graduates. And so those parties, the voices from those parties that are actually directly affected, are really important. And I do think claiming that, let's say, claiming that status as far as like, yeah, I'm a newcomer, but I'm getting drastically affected by the legacy system that you all set up. And I'm here to tell you what's not working and how this space is really changing. And please join with me in preserving the the roots and the positives of this credential, because it's it's in decline. The decline is clear. So what can we do about it together, and to just come to forums and make your voice heard as a current student and a new graduate. That's really important.
So my guests today on this very special episode of This Week in College Viability podcast have been Ryan Hofer and Bex Groebner, who are both experienced in the naturopathic doctorate programs and in the acupuncture programs on the West Coast, I understand. Ryan, Bex, thanks for making time today. And for those who have questions, I'll leave contact information in the show notes. And my name is Gary Stocker at College Viability. Thanks for making time to listen.